There is a particular quality to the silence inside a church at 5:30 in the morning that exists nowhere else on earth. It is not simply the absence of sound. It is the presence of something, a held breath, a concentrated attention, the specific weight of a space that has absorbed decades of weeping and praising and wrestling and surrendering, and knows how to hold all of it at once without confusion. I have been arriving at New Covenant Full Gospel Baptist Church before dawn on the first Saturday of every month for 11 years, and in all of that time I have never stopped feeling it, that silence as a living thing, waiting, prepared, already praying before I opened the door. The first Saturday in March was no different. The parking lot was empty except for two other cars, Sister Beverly's gray sedan and Rochelle's burgundy SUV, which had been there before mine every single month for 9 of those 11 years, because Rochelle Denise Farrow was constitutionally incapable of arriving second to anything. I gathered my Bible, my prayer journal, a fat, worn thing with a broken spine and a ribbon bookmark I had replaced 4 times, and my thermos of black coffee, and I walked through the side door of the sanctuary into that waiting silence. The prayer room was at the back of the education wing, a converted classroom with the desks removed and replaced with a circle of padded metal chairs, 2 kneeling benches along the wall, a small table with a candle and a cross and a bowl for written prayer intentions, and windows that faced east so that when the sunrise came, it came directly and fully into the room like something that had been aiming at it all night. I loved that room the way I love very few places in this world. It had held me on some of the most significant nights of my life. Rochelle was already in her chair, eyes closed, lips moving slightly in what I knew was her private warm-up, the specific pre-prayer practice of a woman who had been interceding so long that the transition between ordinary consciousness and deep prayer had become nearly seamless. She was 52 years old, built with the solid, purposeful frame of a woman who had never wasted much energy on anything, natural gray locks that fell past her shoulders, and a presence that made rooms feel more serious than they had been before she entered them. People at New Covenant called her the Watchman, not as a title but as a description. The specific acknowledgement that she was someone whose spiritual attention was reliable and uncommon. I had known her for 14 years. We had met in this very prayer room, 2 black women, who had independently decided that intercession was the most important thing they could do with their early Saturday mornings, and who had recognized in each other the particular seriousness that marks someone for whom faith is not a Sunday arrangement. We had prayed through her mother's illness and death. We had prayed through my divorce. We had prayed through the opening of my catering business, through the church's building campaign, through 3 pastoral transitions and 2 community crises. There was almost nothing about either of our lives that the other did not know. That was the gift. That was also, I would come to understand, the weapon. My name is Nadine Celestin Howell Patterson. I am 49 years old. I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, in a Pentecostal household where prayer was not scheduled but perpetual. My grandmother, a woman named Estelle, prayed in the kitchen while she cooked, prayed in the garden while she weeded, prayed under her breath during church business meetings in a way that was not inattention but parallel attention, keeping one conversation with the people in front of her and one with God, simultaneously and with equal sincerity. She passed to glory when I was 19 and left me 2 things, her cast iron skillet and her theology of prayer, both of which I have used nearly every day since. I moved to Houston at 26 for a corporate food services management job that lasted 8 years and taught me everything I know about running a large-scale kitchen operation. When the company downsized, I did not mourn the job. I had been planning my exit for 2 years. I opened Nadine's Table, a catering company specializing in event catering for churches, family celebrations, corporate events, and the particular category of Southern food that I had learned from my grandmother and refined over a decade of professional cooking out of my own savings, and with a commercial kitchen space I shared with another small food business for the first year. That was 15 years before the story I am about to tell you. By the time of that first Saturday in March, Nadine's Table had 4 full-time employees, a contract with 3 churches including New Covenant, 2 corporate clients, and a reputation in Houston's black church catering community that I had built one beautifully prepared dish and one reliably honored commitment at a time. I was also, at the time of that first Saturday in March, the co-leader of New Covenant's Women's Intercessory Prayer Ministry, a position I had held for 3 years alongside Rochelle, who was the lead intercessor, I taught the first Friday evening prayer workshops. I coordinated the monthly Saturday prayer circles. I was planning, that spring, a women's prayer retreat for 60 women at a conference center outside the city. The first retreat I had organized entirely on my own, a project I had been building for 8 months with the full support of our pastor, Reverend Daniel Okafor, a Nigerian-American man of 57, whose theology of prayer aligned so completely with my own that I had sometimes thought God had placed him at New Covenant specifically for the season I was in. I am telling you all of this so you understand the fullness of what I had to lose, because this story is about a woman who was positioned precisely at the intersection of her professional calling and her spiritual calling and her deepest human trust, and who had all three of those things threatened at the same time, by the same hand, in the same season. I settled into my chair that morning. Rochelle opened her eyes and gave me the smile she always gave me at the start of prayer circle. Warm, specific, the smile of someone who is genuinely glad you are in the room. I gave it back. Sister Beverly arrived 3 minutes later, with Sister Thomasina behind her, stamping cold off her shoes, and then the room was full of the 5 of us who made up the core of the Saturday circle. And Rochelle opened us with the prayer she always opened with, Psalm 5, verse 3. My voice shalt thou hear in the morning, O Lord. In the morning will I direct my prayer unto thee, and will look up. I closed my eyes. I let the silence receive me. I felt, as I always felt in that room at that hour, that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I did not know that the woman praying across the circle from me had already begun the work of dismantling everything I had built. Let me take you back 6 months before that March morning, to the beginning of what I did not yet know was a beginning. It was September. I had recently received the formal approval from Reverend Okafor and the church board to plan the women's prayer retreat, which was a significant professional and spiritual milestone for me. It meant that my leadership in the prayer ministry had been recognized at the institutional level, that my vision for what the ministry could be was being trusted and resourced. I was, to use the plain language of a woman who does not usually spend time describing her own emotional states, genuinely happy. The catering business was stable. The ministry was growing. My daughter Camille, who was 26 and lived in Dallas, had called the week before to tell me she had been accepted into a graduate program in public health, and I had cried in my car in the parking lot of a grocery store for 15 minutes out of pure gratitude. I told Rochelle about all of it. I told her about the retreat approval and the catering numbers and Camille's acceptance over coffee in her kitchen the following Saturday, after prayer circle, the way we always decompressed after the early morning coffee. Eggs if one of us had time to make them. Conversation that moved easily between the practical and the spiritual, because in our friendship those two territories had never been fully separate. Rochelle listened the way she always listened, fully, with the particular quality of attention that had always made me feel genuinely received, rather than merely heard. She said she was proud of me. She said the retreat was going to change women's lives. She said Camille was going to do remarkable things. All of that was true, and she believed it, and I knew she believed it. What I did not know, what I had no framework to suspect, was that Rochelle had been carrying something for several years that had quietly fermented into something I would not have recognized as what it was until it was too late to contain it. I did not know that she had wanted the retreat, not the planning of it. She would have declined that, because Rochelle's gifts were intercessory and pastoral rather than administrative, and she knew it. But the recognition, the appointment, the formal acknowledgement from Reverend Okafor and the board that a woman of her spiritual standing and 11 years of service to the prayer ministry was the one being trusted with the ministry's largest initiative. She had expected, when the retreat was first discussed in a board meeting the previous spring, that her name would be the one suggested. It had not been. Mine had. I did not learn any of this directly, and not for many months. I am telling it to you now, from the other side of it, because understanding the architecture of the wound helps explain the architecture of what came from it. Rochelle was not a malicious woman, in the way that some people are malicious with pleasure in the harm. She was a good woman who had allowed a specific hurt to go unaddressed and unspoken long enough that it had developed its own logic, its own justifications, its own slow-moving plan, and she knew everything about me. The first sign I noticed but did not recognize as a sign was in October. I was in Rochelle's kitchen again, and I mentioned casually, In the way you mention things to a woman who has known you for 14 years and with whom you have no guarded places, that Nadine's table had had a slow third quarter. Not alarming, I told her. Seasonal variation was normal in event catering, but I had dipped into my operating reserve for the first time in 2 years, and it had reminded me to look carefully at my Q4 projections. I was not worried, I was being prudent. I told her the numbers in the specific, transparent way that I told Rochelle everything. She said the right things. She said the Lord would provide and that my business instincts were sound and that she would be praying over the finances specifically. She even wrote something in her prayer journal, right there at the table, which moved me. The second sign was in November. I had been experiencing some fatigue, not alarming fatigue. The fatigue of a woman who runs a catering business and leads a prayer ministry and is planning a 60-person retreat while serving on 2 church committees. But I had mentioned to my doctor that I was tired more than usual and she had ordered some labs to rule out a few things. All came back normal except for a slightly low ferritin level that explained the fatigue and was easily corrected with an iron supplement. It was a non-issue medically, but I had told Rochelle about the labs in the weeks before the results came back. When I was in the particular quiet anxiety of waiting to know whether the fatigue was something or nothing, I had told her in prayer specifically. In a private prayer session we did together on a Wednesday evening when I was feeling the anxiety more acutely and had asked her to pray with me about it. She had prayed beautifully. She had held my hands. She had said, Lord, you know what is happening in Nadine's body and you have her in your care and we are trusting your report over every other report. I had felt genuinely comforted. I am telling you about these moments because I need you to understand how a weapon is made. A weapon requires material, and the material was my trust. And the trust was built over 14 years in the specific vulnerability of shared prayer, the place where a woman says things she would never say anywhere else, things she says only to God and to the person praying beside her, things that live in the interior of her life rather than the surface. The third sign was in December, and this one I noticed more clearly but still did not name correctly. Reverend Okafor called me into his office for what he described as a routine check-in about the retreat planning. I had been in his office dozens of times. He was an accessible pastor who maintained personal relationships with his ministry leaders and whose check-ins were genuinely routine. But this one had a slightly different quality. He asked me how I was doing, not the pastoral how are you but a more specific version. The how are you of a man who has received information that prompted him to ask. He asked how Nadine's table was going. He asked about my health. Had I been feeling well? I answered all of it honestly and without alarm. But after I left his office, I sat in my car for a few minutes, turning the meeting over in my mind. The questions had been too specific, too triangulated. Someone had been talking to him about me, not about the retreat, not about ministry matters, but about me personally, my business, my health. And I could not think of who else would know the specific details of both. I did not let myself finish that thought, not completely. Because the conclusion of that thought was a conclusion I was not yet willing to draw about a woman I had prayed with for 9 years, but something had shifted in me. The way something shifts when your body registers a threat before your mind is willing to process it. I drove home from that December meeting with the specific interior weather of a woman who is pretending to herself that the sky is clear while something at the edge of her vision is moving that she is not ready to look at directly. Lord, I don't know what I'm feeling right now. I don't know what is happening, or whether I am seeing something true or imagining something frightening. I am asking you for clarity, not partial clarity, not the kind that lets me stay comfortable, full clarity. Because I have learned that the comfortable version of the truth is often not the version I actually need. Give me what I need, even if it costs me something to receive it. January. The retreat was 12 weeks away, and the planning was in full execution. I had confirmed the conference center. The speaker, a black woman pastor named Reverend Gloria Merritt from Dallas, who was one of the most gifted women I had ever heard preach and who had agreed to come without a speaker fee because she believed in the vision, the catering menu, the worship team, and the registration system. 53 women had already signed up. I was sleeping 5 hours a night and waking up energized, which is how I know I am in my calling. In the third week of January, I received a phone call from the administrative director of one of my corporate catering clients, a mid-sized property management company that had been with Nadine's table for 4 years and represented a significant portion of my annual revenue. The director, a woman named Patricia who I had always found warm and direct, called to tell me that they were going to take their catering needs in-house for the coming year. She said it was a budget decision. She was professional, she was kind, she wished me well. I thanked her and ended the call and sat very still at my desk. It was a business loss. Significant but survivable. I had lost clients before. I knew how to absorb a client's departure and adjust my projections. But something about the call left me with a residue that went beyond the financial math. Patricia had said budget, and I had no reason to disbelieve her, but the quality of her voice had been slightly more careful than the situation warranted. The warmth had been slightly more deliberate than natural. She was being kind in the way people are kind when they are also being protective of information they have decided not to share. 2 weeks later, I was in a conversation with Sister Beverlyn from New Covenant's Events Committee, a woman who helped coordinate the church's event calendar and who I had worked with on 3 separate catering contracts, and she mentioned, very casually, in the way things are mentioned that are too significant to be mentioned casually, that the events committee was reconsidering the catering structure for the church's spring events. When I asked what that meant, she got slightly flustered and said it was still in discussion. When I followed up directly with the events committee chair the following week, I was told that the committee was reviewing all vendor relationships as a matter of standard practice. I had catered New Covenant's events for 6 years. I had never had a contract review. I went home that night and I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and I made a list. Not of feelings but of facts. Reverend Okafor's questions about my business and health in December, Patricia's careful kindness, the events committee's sudden vendor review, and underneath those 3 things, a question I had been refusing to write, which I now wrote in the plain and unsparing terms it required. Who talks to all of these people? Who has access to information about my business, finances, and my health and would have reason to share it in a way that creates doubt? I looked at what I had written. I put down my pen. I sat in the particular quality of silence that is not the silence of peace but the silence of something shattering, slowly enough that you can hear each piece. The retreat was scheduled for the 2nd weekend of March, the March prayer circle. That first Saturday morning I described to you at the beginning of this story, happened 3 weeks before the retreat. I had not yet confronted Rochelle. I had not yet taken my list to anyone. I was holding what I knew in the way you hold something that, once placed on a table in front of another person, cannot be unpicked, and I was not yet certain enough of what I was seeing to do that. I needed one more piece. I needed to see the thing directly, rather than in reflection. God, in His specific and sometimes uncomfortable mercy, arranged for me to see it directly. 2 weeks before the retreat, Rochelle asked to meet with me to go over the prayer schedule for the weekend. We met on a Tuesday evening at New Covenant in the small conference room adjacent to the prayer room. I arrived first. She arrived 7 minutes later, which was unusual. Rochelle was never 7 minutes late. She came in slightly out of breath and slightly composed, the way a person comes in when they have been in another conversation immediately before this one. We went through the prayer schedule. It was a productive meeting. Rochelle had genuine ideas, and her understanding of intercessory rhythm was, as always, exceptional. I made notes. I thanked her. We were packing up when she said, in the tone she used for things she was presenting as pastoral rather than personal, "Nadine, I want to pray specifically over the retreat leadership this week. I've been sensing some spiritual warfare around the ministry, not the retreat itself, but some vulnerabilities in the leadership structure that I think we need to cover." I looked at her. I said, "What vulnerabilities?" She said, with the careful vagueness of someone navigating a line they have drawn for themselves, just areas where the enemy could find entrance, stress, distraction, things that pull a leader's attention from the calling. I don't want to be specific, I just want to cover it in prayer. I said, "Are you talking about me?" She said, with a warmth that was so well practiced that a woman who didn't know her 14 years might not have heard the management in it. "I'm talking about covering the ministry. That includes both of us." I nodded. I said I thought that was a good idea. I drove home and I called my daughter Camille. Camille is 26 years old and she has her father's directness and my grandmother, Estelle's discernment, and she has worked since age 19, as if she was personally instructed by God not to waste time. I told her everything, not my feelings about everything, the facts of everything, in the order they had happened. She was quiet in the specific way she goes quiet when she is assembling a picture. She said, "Mama, what does Rochelle know about your business?" I told her. She said, "And what does she know about your health?" I told her. She said, "And she has a relationship with your pastor, with the church events committee, and presumably with enough people in the Houston church community to reach a corporate client." I said yes. She said, "Then you already know what happened. What you don't have yet is confirmation. And I think you need to get confirmation before the retreat, not after. Because if this woman is going to do something at the retreat with the information she has, you need to know before you put 60 women in a room with her." I asked her how I would get confirmation. She said, "Talk to someone who would know if they'd been approached. Someone Rochelle might have talked to who loves you enough to tell you the truth." I thought for a long moment. I said, "Beverly." Sister Beverly had been in my prayer circle for 6 years. She was 63, a retired school administrator, a woman of absolute personal integrity who I had watched navigate more difficult situations than most people encounter in a lifetime. She and Rochelle were cordial but not close, a distinction that mattered now. I called her the next morning. I asked her directly, because Beverly did not respond to anything less than directness. "Has Rochelle said anything to you about me, about my business, or my health, or my fitness to lead the retreat?" There was a silence. Then Beverly said, "Nadine, I have been praying about whether to come to you with something. I think God just answered that prayer," she told me. She told me that 3 months earlier, Rochelle had sat with her after a prayer circle and, framing it as a prayer concern, had shared that she was worried about Nadine's stability, that Nadine's business was struggling, that Nadine had been having health issues she was downplaying, that she seemed distracted and potentially not ready for the responsibility of the retreat. Beverly had told her that she didn't share those concerns, and Rochelle had moved the conversation elsewhere. Beverly said, "I should have come to you immediately. I convinced myself it was just Rochelle being Rochelle, overly concerned, overly spiritual about everything, but I should have come to you." I told her what I had told Camille the night before, the full accounting, the list on the legal pad. Beverly was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Baby, what Rochelle did with your prayer confessions is one of the most serious violations I have encountered in 40 years of church ministry. She took what you gave her in the presence of God and she used it as a tool. That is not spiritual warfare. That is the thing spiritual warfare is supposed to protect us against." I sat with those words for the rest of that day. The women's prayer retreat began on a Friday evening in mid-March. 61 women, we had 3 late registrations, arrived at a conference center 40 minutes outside Houston as the sun was going down, and the Texas sky was doing what Texas skies do in March, which is perform a sunset with an ambition that seems almost excessive, the kind of orange and violet and deep rose that makes even the most practical woman stop what she is doing and acknowledge that the earth is showing off. I had prayed over every detail of that retreat. Every menu choice and every room assignment and every element of the worship schedule and every word Reverend Gloria Merritt would speak. I had prayed over it because I knew that the enemy was going to try to use it, and I intended that it be used for what it was built for. 61 women encountering the living God in a concentrated, protected, intentional space. I had also spoken to Reverend Okafor the Tuesday before the retreat. I had brought my legal pad. I had told him everything. Methodically, without performance, with the specific clarity of a woman who has had 10 days to assemble information and knows how to present it without editorializing. The private prayer confessions shared with Rochelle over years. The conversations Beverly had described. The pattern of questions in his own December meeting with me, which I presented not as an accusation against him, but as evidence that someone with detailed knowledge of my personal situation had been speaking to people in positions of authority in a way designed to raise doubts about my leadership. Reverend Okafor listened with the stillness of a man receiving information he does not want but cannot refuse. When I finished, he said, "Nadine, I owe you an apology. When concerns were brought to me, I should have come directly to you rather than making private inquiries. I did not handle that correctly." I thanked him. I told him the retreat was going forward. I told him I would handle the situation with Rochelle directly after the retreat, and that I was asking him to be available to be part of that conversation. He agreed. Then I went to that retreat and I led every single session with my full heart and my full attention, and the 61 women who showed up got every piece of what I had spent 8 months building for them. Reverend Gloria Merritt preached from Isaiah 43 on Friday night. "Behold, I will do a new thing. Now it shall spring forth. Shall ye not know it?" And by the end of the message 11 women had come to the altar and 3 had surrendered their lives to Christ. I am not going to pretend that Rochelle's presence at that retreat was comfortable for me. It was not. There were moments when I watched her lead an intercessory session with her eyes closed and her hands raised, and I felt the specific complexity of seeing someone doing the real thing, because Rochelle's prayer gift was genuine. That was the painful truth of it. In a body that had also done harm, gifts and wounds can occupy the same person. I have spent enough years in faith community to know that it does not make the wound less real. But it was on the Saturday morning of the retreat, during the scheduled open intercession session, that the thing happened that I had half known was coming and had not known how to prepare for. Rochelle was leading the intercession. The room was full of women on their knees, some at the kneeling benches, some on the floor, some in their chairs with their heads bowed. The presence in the room was genuine and thick and real. And Rochelle began to pray with the specific building cadence she used when she was going somewhere. Not just warming up, but moving toward a destination. She said, "Lord, we come before you on behalf of this ministry and all who lead it. And we ask you to expose what needs to be exposed and strengthen what needs to be strengthened. We pray for anyone in leadership who is carrying burdens they have not surrendered, financial pressures that are creating distraction from the calling, physical weaknesses that are creating vulnerability in the spirit, the weight of trying to build something that feels beyond their capacity." The room continued in prayer around her. Several women began to echo her words in their own whispered prayers. She said, "Lord, we pray for the one who has been given much responsibility but whose foundation may not yet be strong enough to hold it. We ask you to do what only you can do, to protect this ministry from the failures of human weakness, to guard against the enemy's access through the cracks that stress and struggle create." I was kneeling at one of the benches. My eyes were open. I heard every word. And I knew, with the cold, absolute certainty of a woman hearing her own private confessions reconstructed in the language of prayer, exactly what was happening. My financial struggle in Q3, my health labs, my retreat that feels beyond capacity, which is something I had said to Rochelle word for word in a prayer session in November, when I was overwhelmed and trusting her with the weight of it. She was praying me out, in front of 61 women, under the cover of intercession. I stood up. I did not interrupt the prayer loudly. I did not perform. I stood, and I moved to the front of the room, and I placed my hand gently on Rochelle's shoulder, and I said, in a voice calibrated to carry to the room without cutting through the prayerful atmosphere like a blade, "Let me take us somewhere else. Sister Rochelle, thank you. I want to close this intercession." She opened her eyes. She looked at me. And in her eyes I saw the same thing I had been looking for since January, the specific recognition of a woman who has been caught mid-action, the fractional moment before the composure reassembles itself. It was enough. It was everything I needed to see. I led the room in a closing prayer that moved us completely away from where Rochelle had been taking us, and into a prayer of corporate strength and vision for the ministry. And when I said amen, 61 women said amen back, and no one in that room except Rochelle, and I knew what had just happened. The retreat ended Sunday afternoon. I said my proper goodbyes to every woman who had come. I thanked Reverend Gloria Merritt for the most powerful preaching I had heard in years. I stood at the door and I received the embraces of women who told me the retreat had changed something in them, and I received each one fully, because they were true and they were mine. And then I drove the 40 minutes back to Houston alone, and I let myself feel, privately and without audience, the full weight of what the weekend had held. Lord, I need to tell you something you already know. I am hurt in a place that is hard to reach. Not just hurt, confused. Because the woman who did this is also a woman who can pray. Because the place where the wound was made was in prayer itself. You took the most sacred thing I know, the thing I trust most, the thing I run to when everything else is uncertain, and you let it be used against me. I don't understand that yet. I'm asking you to help me understand it, not immediately, not before I'm ready, but eventually. Because I am going to need to make sense of this before I can put it in the category of redeemed things. I'm not there yet. I am just asking you to stay close while I find my way there. The conversation with Rochelle happened on a Thursday evening, 6 days after the retreat. Reverend Okafor was present, as he had agreed to be. Sister Beverly was present because I had asked her to witness it. We met in the prayer room, which I had chosen deliberately, not to make anyone comfortable but because I wanted the conversation to happen in the space where it had begun, in the sacred context rather than the administrative one. I had prepared for the conversation the way I prepared for everything important, with a list, with prayer, and with the specific intention not to be louder than necessary. I laid out everything. I did it in the same methodical way I had done it for Reverend Okafor. Rochelle listened with the stillness of a woman who had known this conversation was coming and had been deciding how to meet it. When I finished, she said, "Nadine, I have been genuinely concerned about you." I said, "I know you believe that. And I want you to hear me say clearly, that is not what this is. What you shared with Reverend Okafor, with Beverly, and potentially with others, that was not pastoral concern. It was private information from our prayer sessions. From the places where I was most vulnerable, and you took it outside the prayer room," she said. "I took it to people who needed to know." Reverend Okafor spoke then, quietly and with the particular authority of a man choosing his words with care. He said, "Sister Rochelle, what you shared with me 3 months ago presented concerns about Sister Nadine's fitness for ministry leadership. I have since had direct conversations with Sister Nadine that tell me a very different story. The concerns you presented came from a source of information, private prayer, that was not yours to use in that way. And I have to be direct with you. That is a serious matter." What followed was a conversation that went 45 minutes and did not end with resolution, because these conversations rarely do. Rochelle did not deny what she had done. She did not fully acknowledge the harm of it. She occupied the particular position of a person who has convinced herself that her motivations were pure enough to justify the method, and who cannot yet see that the method was the violation, regardless of the motivation. She was not, in that room, a villain performing cruelty. She was a woman who had lost herself in a story she had told herself about why she had the right to do what she did, and who was not yet ready to let go of that story. I did not need her to let go of it in that room. I had not come for her confession. I had come for the record to be set straight in front of witnesses, and for the institutional accountability that the situation required. Reverend Okafor, before we left, asked Rochelle to step back from her ministry leadership roles for a period of structured reflection and accountability, and to meet with him and the associate pastor for pastoral counseling over the following months. He said this was not punitive but restorative language. I appreciated, though I also sat with the reality that the structure of the church's response was not something I could control, and that what happened between Rochelle and her own reckoning was not mine to manage. She left the prayer room before I did. I sat for a few minutes after she left, in the chair I had sat in every first Saturday morning for 11 years, in the silence that had held me in good seasons and hard ones, and I said nothing out loud and I asked for nothing specific. I just sat, and the silence held me the way it always had. I want to tell you what the next 12 months looked like, because the story is not finished at the confrontation. The confrontation was the climax, not the ending. And the ending, the real ending, the one that makes this worth telling, is in what was built from the wreckage. The catering contract with New Covenant was not lost. Reverend Okafor spoke with the events committee directly, and while the details of that conversation were not shared with me, the contract was renewed for the following year without further discussion. The corporate client I had lost, Patricia's company, was not recoverable, and I did not attempt to recover it. I absorbed the loss, and I moved forward. Within 4 months I had replaced that revenue with 2 new church catering contracts in the Houston area. Referrals from women who had attended the retreat and returned to their own congregations speaking about what the weekend had been. Word of mouth, the most ancient marketing in the world, and still the most powerful. I hired a business development consultant, a black woman named Sonia, who specialized in small food businesses, and who told me in our first meeting that my pricing model was conservative and my referral network was underutilized. She was right on both counts. I raised my rates. I built a formal referral partnership with 2 event planning companies that served the Houston Black church community. I created a package specifically for church women's events that included not just food but full event, setup and aesthetic curation, centerpieces, serving presentation, the whole environment of a beautifully prepared table, which was the thing I had always loved about catering and had never formally sold as a service. Within 8 months, Nadine's table had its best revenue year since opening. I will tell you plainly, the loss of that corporate client had scared me. Not the loss itself, but what it had revealed, that I had been operating a business without examining my own financial vulnerability closely enough, that the comfort of a few stable contracts had allowed me to be less strategic than I should have been. Rochelle's interference had, in its terrible and unintended way, forced me to look at my own business with the eyes of someone who could not afford to be complacent. I looked. I did not like everything I saw. I fixed what needed fixing. That is, the specific grace of being forced to see clearly. The prayer ministry required a full reconstruction. Rochelle's formal step back left a structural gap that Reverend Okafor and I addressed by rewriting the ministry's leadership model entirely, moving from a lead, intercessor structure to a distributed leadership model where 4 women shared the facilitation of different aspects of the ministry, with no single person holding disproportionate authority over the group. I led that restructuring. It was some of the most important institutional work I have ever done in a church context, because what we were building was not just a new org chart but a set of values about how trust functions inside a prayer community. What is sacred, what is bounded, what belongs to the group and what belongs only to God and the individual. We wrote it down. We put it in a document that we called the Covenant of the Prayer Room, and it specified clearly and without ambiguity that what is shared in prayer, the personal confessions, the private burdens, the vulnerable interior of a person's life, is held in confidence by every person in that room, period, without exception, regardless of how well-intentioned the sharing of it might feel. We presented it to the entire ministry. We asked everyone to sign it. Every woman in that prayer community signed it. Some of them, I later learned, signed it with the specific relief of a woman who had long felt that the informal norms around prayer privacy were insufficient but had not known how to name that feeling or address it. I had named it for them. The harm that had been done to me had given me the language and the urgency to build something protective for everyone who came after. That is the redeemed thing I was not able to see in the car driving home from the retreat. But it was being built the whole time. Rochelle. I need to tell you about Rochelle, because she is not a minor character in this story, even in its resolution. And because integrity requires that I tell her story honestly rather than allowing her to function simply as the antagonist who exits stage left once the plot requires her to. She went through 4 months of pastoral counseling with Reverend Okafor and Associate Pastor Terrence Washington. I was not part of those sessions. I did not receive reports from them. What I know is what Reverend Okafor shared with me in the most general terms, that the work was genuine, that Rochelle had done real reckoning with what she had done and why, and that the foundation of it was a wound around recognition and professional value that had been present for years, without being addressed, and had found the wrong outlet. 8 months after the confrontation in the prayer room, Rochelle asked to meet with me. I agreed. We met in a coffee shop near the church, neutral ground, not the prayer room, not a church office. She said, I am not here to ask for your forgiveness before you are ready to give it, and I am not here to explain myself in a way that makes what I did more comfortable. I am here to say directly to your face that what I did was a violation of your trust and a violation of the sanctity of the prayer room and a violation of who I have spent 25 years trying to be. I am sorry, I did not do it out of hatred, but I did do it, and the reason doesn't clean the harm. I looked at her for a long moment. I said, Rochelle, I received that, and I want to tell you something. I have had to work hard to be able to say honestly, your gift is real, your prayer gift, the thing you do in that room, it is genuinely from God. What you did with information you received in that room is a different thing from the gift. And I am choosing to believe that the gift can survive what happened, because I have watched God redeem harder situations. She cried, not performatively, the specific quiet crying of a woman who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had just set a portion of it down. I did not hug her. I was not there yet. But I also did not leave before she had finished crying, because leaving felt like the wrong kind of distance. I stayed and I handed her a napkin and I let the moment be what it was, incomplete, honest, real. That is forgiveness in its early stages. Not warm, not comfortable, not restored to what it was before, but present. And presence, I have learned, is where healing starts. 1 year after the retreat, first Saturday in March, I arrived at New Covenant before dawn. The parking lot had different cars in it now. The prayer circle had grown from 5 to 9 women. and the restructured ministry had drawn 3 new members who had never participated in intercessory prayer before, and who were learning the language of it with the specific wonder of people discovering a practice that fits them like something that had always been waiting. I gathered my Bible. My prayer journal, a new one, started the previous June, not yet broken in the way the old one had been. My thermos of black coffee. I walked through the side door into the silence. The prayer room was warm. Someone had arrived before me, Sister Thomasina, who had taken on the building access responsibility and who was 70 years old and had the specific energy of a woman who had decided that age was not a reason to slow down when there was praying to be done. She was already at the kneeling bench. I settled into my chair. I opened my journal to a blank page. I wrote the date and I wrote the reference. Psalm 5, verse 3. I looked at the east windows where the sunrise was preparing itself somewhere beyond the dark. I thought about my grandmother Estelle, who prayed in the kitchen and the garden and the business meeting and never separated the sacred from the practical, because she had known, with the knowledge of a woman who had been taught by experience rather than theology, that the separation was artificial, that everything was sacred if you were willing to look at it with the right eyes. I thought about the list I had made on a legal pad at my kitchen table in January of last year. The methodical accounting of things that had gone wrong, the willingness to look at what I had been refusing to look at. I thought about the retreat and the prayer room and the words I had heard from my own confessions reconstructed in someone else's mouth. I thought about 61 women at altar calls and the covenant of the prayer room, and Sonia the business consultant and the best revenue year Nadine's table had ever had, and the 2 new church contracts and Camille calling from her graduate program to say she was thriving. I thought about Rochelle in a coffee shop with a napkin in her hand. I thought about Grandma Estelle, who would have said, "Baby, God didn't let any of that happen to you. He let all of that happen for you. You just couldn't see the 4 yet because you were still inside the 2. The sunrise came through the east windows the way it always does, directly, fully, without apology. The way light comes when it has been waiting all night and knows exactly where it is going. I closed my eyes. I began to pray. And the silence received me, the way it always had, the way I now understood it always would. Not because I had earned it and not because I had avoided the hard things, but because the hard things had built me into the specific shape of a woman the silence was designed to hold. Lord, I am 49 years old and I am more fully myself than I have ever been in my life. Not because everything went right. Because some things went wrong in exactly the ways they needed to so that I would build the right things in the right places, with the right people. I don't understand all of it yet. I probably won't understand all of it until I am where you are. But I am trusting the architecture of it. The fact that you are not improvising, that every hard thing was load-bearing, that the building I am living in right now is stronger than any building I could have designed for myself because you used materials I never would have chosen. Thank you for the materials I never would have chosen. Thank you for making me into someone who can say that and mean it. I want to tell you about a Wednesday evening in November, 2 years after everything I have just described. We had started a program at New Covenant called Pray and Build, a monthly gathering open to any woman in the church or community who was running or trying to run a business, and who needed both spiritual grounding and practical resource. It had been my idea, born out of the specific convergence of my 2 callings, the prayer ministry and the catering business, and the understanding that these 2 things were not in different categories of my life. They were the same category, building something with faith as the infrastructure and practical work as the daily expression of that faith. The program was led jointly by me and a woman named Dr. Angela Reese, a Black woman in her early 50s who was both a theologian and a certified financial planner. A combination, so specific and so necessary that I had recognized it as a divine appointment the moment Reverend Okafor introduced us. She led the financial and business development components. I led the spiritual formation and prayer components. Together we had served 37 women in the program's first 8 months. On that November Wednesday, a woman came in who was 41 years old and whose name was Simone. She had recently ended a significant relationship and was in the early stages of rebuilding a therapy practice that had suffered during a period of personal upheaval. She came in quiet and careful in the way that people come in when they have been hurt in the specific territory where they are also trying to build, when the wound and the work are occupying the same ground. I watched her during the opening prayer. She was the particular kind of still that is not peace but discipline. A woman holding herself together by the decision to hold herself together rather than by the absence of things pulling her apart. After the session, she came up to me. She said, "Sister Nadine, I want to ask you something." I said, "Please." She said, "How do you trust again? In prayer, I mean. How do you bring the real things back into the prayer room after someone uses the real things against you?" I looked at her for a moment. I said, very slowly, "And with different people than the ones who showed you it was dangerous, and with a community that has a covenant written down that says what is sacred stays sacred, and with God, who was in the room the whole time and who saw what was done with what you gave in vulnerability and who does not count that as your failure." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Did it happen to you?" I said, "Yes." She said, "And you still come back to the prayer room?" I said, "I lead the prayer room." She looked at me with the specific expression of a woman receiving something she needed and had not known how to ask for. I took her name and her contact information. I told her about the program and about the women in the circle and about the covenant of the prayer room and about the specific way that our community had rebuilt its culture of trust from the inside out after it had been violated. I told her, "The prayer room belongs to you. It always did. What happened to you was a theft, and the thief took something real. But she did not take your access to God. She could not take that. Nobody can take that." She nodded. She did not cry, in the particular way of a woman who has already done her crying and is now in the territory of deciding. She came back the following month, and the month after that, and somewhere in the third month, I watched her begin to uncurl, the specific, unhurried opening of a woman finding her way back to herself, and I felt the thing I feel every time I see that opening in someone, which is the feeling that the hardest year of my life was not wasted. Not a moment of it. Not one single moment. My grandmother Estelle told me that, and she was right. She is always right. A reflection for the woman whose trust was used against her. There is a particular loneliness in being wounded in the house of prayer, because prayer was supposed to be the safe place, the place where the walls came down and the real self was allowed to speak without consequence. And when the consequence arrives anyway, from inside the very sanctuary you built for your own survival, the wound goes into the foundation of things. But I want you to hear this. God was in the room. He was in the room when you spoke, and he was in the room when the words were taken, and he is in the room now. Nothing said in his presence is wasted, not even the things that were weaponized. He heard the original, the true prayer, the real confession, the honest cry. He held it. He is holding it still. Proverbs 11:13 says that a gossip betrays confidence, but a trustworthy person keeps a secret. The violation you experienced was a violation of that standard. It was named in the Word because it has happened in communities of faith since communities of faith existed. You are not alone in this. You are in a long line of women who brought their real selves to the sacred space and found the sacred space imperfectly held by imperfect people. What you do with that is your inheritance. You can close, you can shrink the real self until the prayer room only gets a version of you that cannot be hurt, or you can do the harder thing, which is to find the community that honors the covenant. Write the covenant down where it can be held, and bring your whole self back into the room with the full knowledge that vulnerability is not navid, it is courage. God did not waste what was done to you. He is building with it right now. The woman you are becoming requires every piece of what you have been through, including the pieces you would not have chosen. Walk back into the prayer room. Walk in with your real self. Walk in knowing that the silence is waiting, and it has been waiting since before the wound, and it will be waiting long after the wound is healed. You belong there. You always did. If this story touched something in you, if you have ever brought your realest self to someone you trusted in faith and watched them use it against you, I want you to know that you are not alone, and I want to hear from you. Leave a comment. Tell me how you found your way back to yourself. Tell me what you built on the other side of the betrayal. This community is for women who tell the truth about the hard things and keep building anyway. Like this video if it gave you something. It helps other women who need this story find it. Subscribe to Sister Circle Stories, because every week we come here and we gather around the truth about faith and resilience and what it means to stand inside a Black church community with all of its beauty and all of its complications, and choose to stay and build and grow. We are here every week, and we are not going anywhere.